In the golden halls of the Nigerian palace lived a poor servant girl, Amara. One mistake changed her fate forever. The cruel King Oba Adeyemi punished her with the burning coals walk. Days later, when the kingdom thought the horror was over, a greater tragedy struck. The enemy king attacked, and Oba Adeyemi's only daughter was kidnapped. What happens next will leave you shocked. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the rest of this story. The sun blazed over the golden roofs of Oyo's royal palace, its rays bouncing off the polished marble floors and tall carved pillars that stretched toward the sky. The palace was alive with noise and movement. Guards in glittering bronze armor marched across the courtyard. Nobles in brightly colored agbadas discussed politics in hushed tones, and the smell of roasted yam and peppered chicken floated in the air from the palace kitchens. But not everyone in the palace lived in luxury. Among the shadows of this dazzling world moved Amara, a poor servant girl with skin glistening in the sunlight and eyes that carried both exhaustion and hidden strength. She rose before the first cockcrow and worked until the moon claimed the sky, scrubbing floors until her hands blistered, carrying trays so heavy her back ached, and bowing so low before nobles that her knees were always sore. Though she was poor, she was not weak, and in the silent corners of the palace she often whispered prayers for freedom, for dignity, and for the courage to endure another day under the cruelty of her master, Oba Adeyemi, the king who ruled with an iron heart. Oba Adeyemi was feared across the lands. His palace gleamed like paradise, but his justice struck like fire. He believed fear kept the people loyal, so he punished every mistake with ruthless severity. Whispers said he had once exiled a noble simply for coughing during a royal speech, and another time he ordered a servant's back whipped until she could no longer stand for dropping a single kola nut on the palace floor. His eyes were sharp and unforgiving. His voice thundered in the council hall, and when he walked, even the bravest nobles lowered their gaze. To him, servants were no more than tools, useful until they failed, disposable once broken. Amara, though quiet and obedient, had always known she lived on the edge of his temper. She had seen his wrath fall on others and prayed it would never turn on her. Yet fate has a way of testing even the strongest prayers. That fateful evening, the palace was alive with celebration. Drummers beat their talking drums. Singers praised the Oba's ancestors, and courtyards filled with laughter as roasted meat, yam, and palm wine were served to nobles and warriors. The king sat high on his throne, his crown glimmering in the torchlight, his robe woven with golden threads. Amara, dressed in her simple white gown, moved quietly among the guests, balancing a heavy tray of peppered chicken. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew every movement had to be perfect, for the king's eyes missed nothing. She bent low, her hands trembling slightly as she served, until disaster struck. The tray slipped from her fingers, and with a terrible clatter, roasted chicken legs scattered across the polished marble floor, some even rolling to the very feet of King Oba Adeyemi himself. The palace went silent. Drums stopped. Conversations died. Every noble and servant froze as the king slowly looked down at the pieces of meat by his feet. His face darkened like thunderclouds, and his eyes locked on Amara, who had already fallen to her knees, her hands trembling against the floor. "Do you dare insult me in my own palace?" Oba Adeyemi's voice boomed, echoing against the pillars. Amara shook her head, her lips trembling. "Am I king? Forgive me. It was an accident." But her words meant nothing. The king stood, his robe sweeping behind him, and pointed his staff toward her. "Accidents do not exist in the house of Adeyemi. You will be punished so that every eye watcher will remember what happens to those who fail me." The nobles whispered in shock. The guard stiffened, and Amara felt her blood run cold. She knew there was no escape. The cruel king had spoken, and punishment was inevitable. Yet none in the courtyard could have guessed the horror he had in mind. That very night, the order was carried out. Guards seized Amara and dragged her into the central courtyard, where a pit of burning coals had been prepared. The fire roared, its orange glow lighting up the night as sparks rose into the sky like tiny spirits. The smell of smoke filled the air, stinging her nose and making her eyes water. Nobles gathered, their jeweled faces reflecting the flames, whispering about the king's cruelty. "He will make her walk across the fire," one murmured, "barefoot until her flesh burns." Amara's heart pounded louder than the drums. She stared at the pit, at the glowing coals shimmering like red-hot daggers waiting to pierce her skin. She wanted to scream, to beg again, but the king sat on his throne, watching with cold satisfaction, his crown shining in the firelight. To him, this was not cruelty, it was justice. The guards pushed her forward until her toes touched the edge of the burning coals. She closed her eyes, whispered one last prayer under her breath, and prepared herself for the most painful trial of her life. In that moment, the palace held its breath. Servants looked away, unable to watch. Some nobles smiled cruelly, eager for entertainment. And Oba Adeyemi leaned forward, his eyes burning with anticipation. For him, this was more than punishment. It was a lesson, a reminder to every soul in his court that he was not a man to be disobeyed or humiliated. Amara, trembling and drenched in fear, felt the heat rise against her skin like an invisible hand pushing her back. But there was no escape. The guards' spears glinted in the firelight behind her. The king's cold eyes bore into her soul, and the burning path stretched before her, daring her to take the first step. The fire hissed and crackled, its heat licking Amara's skin even before she stepped onto the coals. The courtyard was drenched in silence, the kind of silence that screamed louder than drums. The nobles leaned forward, their jeweled necks glinting in the firelight, waiting to see if the poor servant girl would scream, cry, or collapse. The guards stood tall, their spears crossed behind her, ensuring there was no escape. Amara's knees shook violently, and her breath came in ragged bursts. She had never felt so small in her life, so powerless before the blazing furnace of the king's will. Her bare feet hovered inches above the glowing coals, her skin already stinging from the sheer heat. She whispered a prayer her mother had taught her when she was a child. "O Lord, give me strength to walk through the fire and not be consumed." And with a deep trembling breath, she lifted her foot and took the first step. The moment her skin touched the fiery surface, pain shot up her leg like lightning. Her body screamed in protest, her muscles convulsed, and for a brief instant her vision blurred with tears. Gasps erupted from the nobles, some covering their mouths in shock, others smirking at the cruel spectacle. The smell of burning flesh began to rise, sickening and sharp, but Mara clenched her fists, her eyes blazing with determination. She lifted her other foot and took another step, then another, each one feeling like a blade cutting into her flesh. But within her pain burned a fire of defiance. She would not give the king the satisfaction of seeing her crawl. She would not cry out and beg, as so many had done before her. Her voice stayed locked in her throat. Her back remained straight, and she forced her legs to move forward. For every step she took, she imagined her freedom. She imagined a life where she was no longer under the shadow of cruelty, and somehow that vision pushed her forward across the coals. Oba Adeyemi watched from his golden throne, his expression hard and unreadable. Deep inside, he had expected the girl to collapse after 2 or 3 steps, to scream and beg for mercy, to confirm his power in front of the entire court. Yet as Amara walked, sweat dripping from her face, flames rising around her, something shifted in the atmosphere. The nobles, who had come expecting a moment of humiliation, now watched in stunned silence. Some whispered, "She is enduring, she is not falling." The guards who had dragged her here exchanged uneasy glances. And though Adeyemi tried to maintain his stern expression, a shadow flickered across his face, an irritation, almost fear, that this servant girl might walk to the fire and rise unbroken. To him, that was not justice, it was defiance. His knuckles whitened around the arm of his throne as he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing like a predator watching prey that refused to die. Amara's feet felt like they were being pierced by 1,000 knives, but she kept moving, step by step, until the pit of coals stretched behind her and the cool stone floor of the courtyard kissed her blistered skin. The moment she stepped out, she collapsed to her knees, her breath tearing from her chest in ragged gasps. The crowd erupted, some in disbelief, others in murmurs of admiration. Never before had anyone endured the burning coals walk and survived with such resilience. Servants in the crowd covered their mouths, tears welling in their eyes, for in Amara's pain they saw their own suffering, and in her endurance they saw hope. The nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering that perhaps the king's cruelty had gone too far, that perhaps this girl's survival was a sign of something greater. But Adeyemi slammed his staff against the marble floor, silencing them all. "She has paid for her mistake," he thundered, his voice echoing through the courtyard. "Let no one mistake endurance for strength. She is nothing more than a servant who has been humbled before her king." His words tried to reassert control, but his tone betrayed a sliver of unease. For the first time, his cruelty had not broken someone. It had revealed their courage. That night, as the flames died down and the nobles retreated to their quarters, whispers spread to the palace like wildfire. Servants whispered Amara's name in the kitchens, praising her bravery. Some said the gods had walked with her across the fire, protecting her feet. Others claimed it was a sign that the king's cruelty had reached its limit, and that the spirits of justice would soon rise against him. Amara lay in the servants' quarters, her body trembling from the burns, her feet wrapped in cloth, but her heart strangely at peace. She had faced the worst the king could offer, and had survived. Though pain racked her body, there was a fire in her soul stronger than any coal. What she did not know was that her act of endurance that night would echo far beyond the palace walls. In villages and markets, in noble courts and rival kingdoms, the story of the servant girl who walked through fire would soon be carried by tongues eager for a tale of hope. And in one rival palace, an enemy king listened with a cunning smile, plotting how to turn Adeyemi's cruelty into his downfall. The story of Amara's survival spread like wildfire across the kingdom. From the bustling markets of Abadan to the quiet farms along the riverbanks, tongues whisper the servant girl who had walked across burning coals and lived. In the dim-lit courtyards of villages, griots sang her name, and children listened wide-eyed, imagining her as a heroine touched by the gods. The tale carried far beyond Oba Adeyemi's palace, until it reached the ears of his greatest rival, King Balagan, ruler of a neighboring land long at war with Adeyemi. Balagan sat on his ebony throne, draped in red and black robes, his sharp eyes narrowing as a messenger recited the story. To him, it was not a tale of courage, but a crack in Adeyemi's iron rule. If a mere servant could endure the punishment meant to humiliate, then Adeyemi's aura of fear was weakening. Balagan's lips curled into a smile, cruel and cunning. "If fire cannot humble a servant," he muttered, "then let fire humble his blood. The king's pride must burn, just as he made others burn." His court fell silent, for they knew when their king spoke of vengeance, storms always followed. One moonless night, Balagan struck. His warriors, dressed in dark leather armor and armed with spears and torches, descended upon Adeyemi's palace with stealth and fury. The palace guards, though strong, were caught unprepared. Flames erupted at the palace gates as arrows tipped with fire shot through the night sky. Shouts echoed to the marble halls, and nobles scrambled in terror, their robes dragging across the polished floors. In the chaos, Balagan's men moved like shadows, weaving through corridors until they reached the royal chambers. There, Adeyemi's only daughter, Princess Ifeoma, slept in her chamber, unaware of the storm tearing through her father's palace. The warriors burst in, silencing her maids, and with swift brutality, they bound her hands and gagged her cries. Her wide, terrified eyes pleaded for mercy, but the invaders carried her into the night, vanishing into the darkness before Adeyemi's soldiers could regroup. By dawn, the palace stood scarred with ash and broken pride. The Oba sat upon his throne, his robes torn, his crown tilted, rage and dread twisting his face. His daughter was gone, stolen by his most hated enemy. For the first time, Oba Adeyemi felt the weight of helplessness. The news of the kidnapping spread to the palace like thunder, shaking even the hardest hearts. Servants wept quietly in corners, for they loved Princess Ifeoma, who had always spoken kindly to them despite her father's cruelty. Nobles whispered anxiously, fearing that the king's enemies now had the upper hand. Adeyemi himself raged like a wounded lion, smashing vessels, shouting at his generals, demanding that Balagan be crushed instantly. Yet beneath his fury was fear, the kind of fear he had never known before. His daughter was not just a princess. She was his only child, the light of his lineage, the future of his throne. Without her, his bloodline would be cut short, and his enemies would laugh at his downfall. He cursed the gods, cursed his enemies, cursed even his own servants, until his voice cracked from shouting. But none of his rage could change the truth. His pride had led him into a trap. Just as he had once made Amara walk across fire, Balogun now planned to make his daughter face the same cruel punishment. And unlike Amara, Ifeoma was no hardened servant used to suffering. She was a princess, delicate and untested by the brutal trials of the world. Far away in Balogun's fortress, the princess was dragged into a courtyard where the rival king awaited, his throne carved from black stone, torches flickering on either side. He looked upon her with mocking eyes, his voice cold as steel. "Your father believed fire was a measure of obedience," Balogun said, "so let fire measure his own blood." With a gesture, his men prepared a pit, filling it with glowing coals until the heat rippled through the air like a living beast. Ifeoma's body trembled violently, her tears streaking down her cheeks as the cruel warriors forced her to stand at the edge of the fiery path. The nobles of Balogun's court laughed cruelly, clapping their hands at the spectacle, eager to see the daughter of their enemy humbled by fire. Ifeoma begged, her voice choked with fear. "Please, please don't." But her words were drowned by the crackling of flames and the jeers of the rival court. For Balogun, this was more than punishment. It was revenge, a message to Adeyemi that his cruelty had returned to haunt him. And as the princess stood trembling before the fire, her father's arrogance seemed to collapse with every flicker of flame. Back in Adeyemi's palace, the king sat broken, his head bowed for the first time in years. His generals argued, some demanding immediate war, others urging patience, but Adeyemi barely listened. His daughter's cries echoed in his mind, though she was miles away. He remembered how he had once forced Amara to face the fire, how he had ignored her pleas for mercy, how he had called it justice. Now, with his own child in the same position, guilt clawed at his chest like a beast. For the first time, he understood the weight of cruelty, not as a ruler looking down on the powerless, but as a father staring into the abyss of loss. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, Amara listened to the whispers of the kidnapping. Her heart tightened at the thought of Princess Ifeoma facing the same trial she had endured. Though she owed the king nothing, though he had caused her unimaginable pain, she could not silence the voice within her that said, "If you survived the fire, it was not only for yourself, it was to save others." With quiet resolve, Amara stood, her burn still raw but her spirit unbroken, ready to walk in the heart of danger to rescue the girl who had shown her kindness in the palace corridors. The path ahead would test her more than fire ever had, but she knew one truth. Destiny had chosen her to face it. Amara's decision was not born out of loyalty to the king, but from something deeper, an unshakable truth that no innocent should suffer for the pride of rulers. The memory of her own feet blistering on the burning coals haunted her like a scar carved into her soul. She could still hear the roar of the crowd, the cold laughter of the nobles, and the silent cruelty in Adeyemi's eyes as he forced her to endure what no human should. And now, in a cruel twist of fate, Princess Ifeoma stood where she once had, trembling before the fire. Amara could not ignore that mirror. She gathered what little strength remained in her battered body, wrapped herself in a plain cloak to disguise her servant's garb, and slipped out of the palace under the shadow of night. The roads of Balogun's land were long and treacherous, but she moved with determination, guided by a single thought. If she survived the coals, it was so she might one day protect those who could not. As she walked through moonlit forests and crossed streams that glimmered like liquid silver, whispers of the wind seemed to urge her onward. Even the stars above appeared to lean closer, as if watching the journey of a girl who defied fire and now walked into the heart of war. Meanwhile, in Balogun's fortress, Princess Ifeoma's trial was cruelly delayed. The rival king wanted Adeyemi's agony to stretch, wanted every passing hour to deepen his rival's torment. He paraded Ifeoma before his court, forcing her to kneel at his feet as nobles mocked her, their laughter slicing through her dignity. Yet despite her tears, there was something regal in the way she held her head, a flicker of her father's strength buried beneath her fear. Balogun noticed it too, and it fueled his cruelty. "The daughter of a lion," he sneered, "but tonight she will crawl like a lamb." At his signal, warriors stirred the coals until sparks leapt into the air like fireflies, the ground glowing with unbearable heat. Ifeoma's legs gave way at the sight, and she sobbed uncontrollably, whispering prayers to the gods her father had long abandoned. But just as the warriors reached for her arms to drag her forward, a shadow slipped into the courtyard. Covered in dust and cloak, Amara stepped silently through the chaos of laughter and flame. Her heart thundered against her chest, but her eyes were steady, burning with the same fire that had carried her across the coals. She had arrived. The court fell silent when Amara threw back her hood. Some recognized her immediately, the servant who had endured the fire in Adeyemi's palace. Murmurs spread like wildfire, nobles pointing and whispering, unable to comprehend how this girl had walked into the den of her king's enemy. Balogun himself leaned forward on his throne, his lips curling with amusement. "Ah," he said mockingly, the co-walker. "Tell me, girl, have you come to save this little bird from the flames?" His warriors laughed, circling her like wolves around a lamb. But Amara did not flinch. Her voice, though soft, carried across the courtyard like a steady drumbeat. "I came because no one deserves to suffer for the pride of kings. Not me, not her." Her words silenced the laughter for a heartbeat, striking a chord even in those hardened by cruelty. Balogun rose slowly from his throne, his towering frame casting a shadow over the fire. "Then perhaps," he sneered, "you will take her place." Without waiting for her reply, he signaled to his men. The crowd roared in approval, eager to see the miracle girl tested again. But Amara did not resist. Instead, she looked at Ifeoma and gave her the faintest nod of reassurance, as if to say, "I have endured before. I will endure again." They dragged Amara to the edge of the glowing path. Heat licked at her skin, blistering her memory of pain, but her spirit did not waver. Ifeoma, still bound, cried out in horror, her voice breaking through the jeers. "No, she saved herself once. Don't make her do it again." But Balogun silenced her with a wave, his eyes locked on Amara with cruel fascination. Slowly, Amara stepped onto the coals. Flames curled around her ankles, the sting of heat shooting up her legs like venom. Gasps rippled to the crowd as she took one step, then another. Each movement was a battle, each breath a prayer. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, yet she did not scream. Her face was set with grim determination, her gaze fixed beyond the fire, as though she saw something no one else could. Warriors and nobles alike fell silent, their laughter replaced by awe. For here was no weak servant girl, but a spirit forged in flame, a living defiance to cruelty itself. Even Balogun, for all his arrogance, felt the edge of unease prick his chest. What power gave this girl the strength to walk where others would collapse in agony? Was it divine? Or was it simply the unbreakable will of a human heart? By the time Amara crossed the final stretch and fell to her knees on the cool stone beyond the fire, the courtyard was silent. Only the crackling of coals filled the air, mocking the absence of laughter. The nobles who had once cheered cruelty now stared in stunned disbelief. Balogun's pride faltered for the first time, though he masked it with a scowl. Amara, trembling and burned, raised her head and spoke with a voice that carried to the fortress like a hymn. "I faced the fire once for myself. This time, I faced it for her. If your pride needs more proof, then burn me again and again until you see the truth. Cruelty cannot break what is born of courage." Her words struck like thunder. For a moment, even the hardened soldiers felt shame ripple through their hearts. Princess Ifeoma sobbed openly, not just from fear, but from the unbearable sight of a girl suffering for her sake. Balogun clenched his fists, torn between rage and the unsettling realization that his spectacle had turned into a triumph. He had wanted to humiliate the bloodline of Adeyemi, but instead he had given power to a servant girl whose name would echo louder than kings. For a long moment, silence reigned in Balogun's courtyard. The crackling of the coals echoed like thunder in the uneasy hush, the smell of burnt flesh clinging to the air like a curse. Amara knelt in the cold stone beyond the fire, her body trembling but her spirit unbroken, her eyes lifted not in defeat but in defiance. The nobles, who only a moment ago had roared with cruel excitement, now found themselves struck with a strange reverence they could not explain. The sight of the servant girl enduring the flames again, not for herself but for the daughter of her king, carved something eternal into their memories. Princess Ifeoma, bound in Tear Street, cried out for her voice breaking the silence like a child calling for a mother. Even Balogun, though his face twisted in anger, felt the weight of her defiance pressing on his chest like an immovable stone. He had intended the spectacle to humiliate his rival's bloodline, but instead it had made him the witness to something greater than power, an act of courage no throne could command. When Amara finally lifted her charred hand toward Ifeoma, the crowd's collective gasp was almost a prayer, as though they too longed for her to rise victorious. And in that single gesture, she transformed from a servant into a savior. Not only the princess, but the idea that dignity could survive even in chains. Balogun's pride, however, could not allow this moment to stand uncontested. His voice boomed to the courtyard like rolling thunder, masking the unease gnawing at his heart. "Enough of this nonsense," he roared, his hand slicing the air. "This girl's theatrics do not change the truth. Adeyemi's bloodline is weak, and tonight I will prove it." He ordered his men to prepare Ifeoma for fire, his words venomous with the rage of a man who feared the truth standing before him. But the spell had already broken. His own warriors shifted uneasily, their eyes betraying the conflict inside them. They had seen Amara's endurance. They had felt the shame in their own laughter turn hollow. Some dropped their gaze, unwilling to meet the servant's steady eyes. Before Balogun could bark another order, Amara staggered to her feet, every step agony yet filled with strength. "If you truly believe courage belongs only to kings," she said, her voice hoarse but unshaken, "then burn me again, but you will never silence the fire that lives within us." The words, raw and unpolished, landed like a storm across the courtyard, and for the first time Balogun saw it. His men were not cheering him. Their silence was no longer obedience. It was doubt. Fear rippled through him, not the servant girl, but the loyalty slipping from his grip like water through clenched fists. Seeing his men hesitate, Balogun lashed out in fury, but before he could restore control, something unexpected happened. A guard who had been ordered to bind Ifeoma suddenly stepped back, refusing to drag her forward. Another followed, his eyes avoiding Balogun's glare. The murmurs spread like wildfire, soldiers whispering among themselves, nobles looking at one another with unease. Amara's act had pierced the heart of the court, planting seeds of defiance even in those long accustomed to cruelty. And then, with a courage she had never known before, Princess Ifeoma herself stood shakily, her voice trembling yet clear. "You call my father weak, but weakness is a cruelty that fears courage. This servant has more honor than any throne built on blood." The courtyard erupted, not with cheers, but with the sound of voices rising in argument, soldiers questioning orders, nobles debating among themselves. Balogun's hand trembled on the arm of his throne as he realized the spectacle had slipped from his control. In desperation, he shouted for silence, but his voice cracked against the tide of doubt. For the first time in years, his court looked not at him but at someone else, a servant girl who had walked through fire twice and lived. Amid the chaos, Amara seized the moment. With the strength of someone who had no choice but to endure, she stumbled to Princess Ifeoma, cutting her bonds with shard of broken pottery. The princess clung to her, sobbing with gratitude, and together they moved toward the courtyard's edge. Guards hesitated, some lowering their spears, others stepping aside as if unwilling to stand against the will of fate itself. Balogun screamed for his men to stop them, but his words were lost in the storm of hesitation and doubt. Step by step, Amara led Ifeoma out of the fortress, through gates that once seemed impenetrable. The journey back to Adeyemi's palace was long, marked by exhaustion and wounds, but the bond between servant and princess carried them forward. At dawn, when the sun painted the horizon in hues of gold and crimson, the palace gates opened to reveal a sight that no one could believe. Amara, battered but unbroken, returning with the king's daughter safe in her arms. Oba Adeyemi, who had spent sleepless nights pacing his halls, tormented by guilt and fear, rushed forward the moment he saw his daughter. Tears, long buried beneath the weight of pride, spilled freely down his face as he embraced Ifeoma with trembling hands. But it was when he turned his eyes to Amara that the palace truly held its breath. Here stood the girl he had once condemned to fire, the servant he had discarded as nothing more than dust under his throne. Yet she had done what no army could. She had crossed into the heart of his enemy's fortress, faced the same fire once again, and returned with the very blood of his lineage. Adeyemi fell to his knees before her, the weight of his pride finally breaking. "I wronged you," he whispered, his voice raw with shame. "I was blinded by cruelty, and you have shown me the meaning of true strength." The nobles gasped at the sight of their king kneeling before a servant, but not one dared to question it, for they too had seen the truth written in fire and sacrifice. From that day, Adeyemi's heart was changed. He no longer ruled with cruelty, but with humility, guided by the servant he once despised. And Amara, though she remained humble, became a symbol whispered across the lands, a reminder that sometimes the greatest crowns are not worn on the head but carried in the heart.